What brought your grandfather to Blanco?
Okay, well what happened was, my grandfather, John Benjamin, was only 16 years old when his father died. And they were in Missouri, so with that, his mother took he and his younger brother, and they headed down to Louisiana, where all the daughters were married to Louisiana men, and where their father's brother Robert lived across in Vicksburg and had the shipping company that went up and down the Mississippi. So they went down there, and John Benjamin was only 16 years old. And then all of a sudden you don't have any money because the breadwinner dies. All the property down in Mississippi and in there, the Union Army burned everything to the ground and left everybody without any money, and then all the slaves went away. In fact, my Armstrong grandfather, his slave had to come get him out of jail when the Union Army put him in jail. And he came and vouched for him, and they let him out. Anyway, John Benjamin came down the Mississippi with his mother and with his younger brother in about 1866, right after the Civil War ended and my grandfather died. And he was 16 years old at the time. So then in 1873, he met a girl named Lizzie Armstrong. And the Armstrongs were also Scots. Everybody in this deal is a Scot, with a few Irishmen thrown in. And the Armstrongs had come down the Mississippi on a flatboat, and they had built the church in Port Gibson, Mississippi, which is still standing today. And it was the only town that Grant didn't burn to the ground because he said it was too pretty to burn. And anyway, John Benjamin met Lizzie Armstrong. He married her, and the parents were not happy about it. He was this young kid, and he had this crazy idea he was going to start a circus. And where he got the idea, we're not sure, except that P.T. Barnum started his circus in 1870. It was just a few years before that. And there was a lot of, up and down the Mississippi going on. And we don't know where he got his idea, but her parents disowned her when she married this Glasscock kid who wanted to start a circus.
What is circus?
But I mean, he's trying to figure out how to have a dime, because all the money gone. And this led to them having this little wagon show, and they lived there in Louisiana, in a place called Delhi, Louisiana, there right off the Mississippi, across from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And the first son, his name was Alex, was born. Alex spent a lot of time in Blanco, had a ranch here himself, and he was born in 1874. Well, about 1875, according to my dad, they started this, they came to Texas. He said they came to San Antonio in 1875, may have been off a few years, but anyway, they started this, John Benjamin and his wife started this wagon show. And Alex was born in 1874, that's the first child. Then they had another child named Aaron who was born in 1876, but he only lived to be 2 years old, he died of something or another. Then in 1878, Gracie was born, the first daughter. By the time she was 3 years old, she was walking on John Benjamin's hands and asking to be in the circus. And he put her in there, and she was a tight wire walker by the time she was 3. And they would travel a route between Louisiana and Texas originally, and then they would swing here up Old 281, they would go up to, all the way up into East Texas into Oklahoma. And up in Oklahoma is where John Benjamin adopted this Indian boy, Ball Coon, who I've talked to people who actually still remember Ball Coon.
Where was the base of their operation at that time? Well,
here's the interesting part. there wasn't a base, so to speak. They were living in wagons.
They were, I see it, was
They would go,
they're nomadic.
apparently the deal was, I mean, they would go back to Louisiana. Like, the first 3 children were born in Louisiana, but only the first 2, which was Alex and this Gracie, were born there around Delhi in Franklin Parish near the Mississippi. The 3rd child was Fred, who was born in 1881, and he was born on the road, so to speak, in Louisiana, halfway between Texas and the Mississippi River. And he was a tight wire walker right away too. They had him walking across, he was like the free attraction to bring people to the circus. He'd walk the tight wire over the tent tops to draw people in. Well, they came to San Antonio originally. I know that from my dad. And then part of the route they took was up through here, through Blanco, and I don't know what years they were probably here in the 1880s, you know. And they would go up to 81, and then they would cut over to East Texas. They would go into Arkansas. They would go into Oklahoma. But if they had an early base, you could call it that, would be San Antonio, or actually south of San Antonio.
Your dad, W.D., was born into a circus family, right? And that's how he got started.
Oh yeah, that's how they all started. He was born in a place called Ditto, Texas, which is in 1886. And Ditto no longer exists. And Ditto is only named Ditto because it had another name, a Spanish name. It's down in Atascosa County, just south of San Antonio, on the Atascosa River. Because when you start studying all this stuff, you realize everybody's always at a river, because how are you going to get anything to drink in those days? But he was born in Ditto, and the reason Ditto's name was Ditto was the name of the town. It came, their post office expired its charter or something, so they sent in the paperwork to renew it, and they said Ditto, and they thought in Austin that meant the name of the town was Ditto. So they named it Ditto, Texas. And they lived there in 1886, and what would happen, they had the circus the whole time, but in the winter it would shut down, and they just stay in one place or another. In fact, apparently John Benjamin worked for the boiler works in San Antonio in that year of 1886, because I have some articles about where my father and brothers are talking about when their father worked for the boiler factory that one year. The year he was born, the year that oil was discovered in Bexar County, which ironically was discovered by accident by a guy drilling a water well whose grandson played on the Little League team with me 80 years later or something. But they were all in the circus. My father played in the band, the Glasscock Circus Band. He got paid $5 a week. He played the tuba and the French horn. You had to do all these multiple tasks. You know, you could walk the tight wire. You could do, you know, everybody was a performer. And so you had Alex did slack wire, which is a different kind of wire walking. He's the one that trained the elephants. You know, he's the guy in the photo with the elephants I showed you. He was the oldest. He was born in 1874. My dad wasn't born until 1886, so he was 12 years younger. About the time my dad was 10 years old is when Alex started teaching him to walk the tight wire. And my theory is what happened here is Alex wanted to have his own circus. And I think he probably tried it for a few years, and he needed a tight wire walker because Fred and Gracie were working for John Benjamin's Glasscock Circus. So he wanted to get my dad to run off with him to start his own. And I think they maybe did that for a couple of years, and then John Benjamin retired and turned the circus over to Alex. This was about 1901. But my dad used to say, at least to me, "Son, I left home with 25 cents in a cardboard suitcase, riding in a wagon." And what he was talking about, he said, I was 14 years old and had a 7th grade education. And what he's talking about is about 1900, he went off with Alex, the older brother, kind of on their own there for a while. And
How did they get an education when they're on the road with the circus?
the mother, Lizzie Armstrong Glasscock, John Benjamin's wife, they had home teaching.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, my sister said, well, they weren't nearly as uneducated as it sounds, because she was like super strict and you had to learn plenty, or else
Very
you're
disciplined
in
family.
trouble. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how disciplined he was, but she apparently was.
Well, your dad went on to become quite a renowned, recognized artist, aerial artist, right? And with
Actually,
Barnum and
yeah,
Bailey.
he and two of the other brothers became very famous. And actually, three of the other brothers. They could all walk the tight wire, and all did. And, you know, they had the iron jaw axe, and it was, you know, one of those photos I showed you before was with the San Antonio Exposition of 1908 when they go to the elephant races.
Mm-hmm.
I've got articles of my dad in the paper talking about the elephant races. This was the same year that, I don't know if you ever knew Ad Topperwine, the guy that shot 70-something thousand wooden blocks. That was the same year, 1908 San Antonio Exposition.
That's a famous name in San Antonio, Topperwine.
Well, that picture I showed you was taken at that same time.
Yeah.
And
We'll go back to those pictures later, and you can point
Right.
out various things when we finish this part of the interview.
okay.
Your dad went on to vaudeville. How did that happen?
Well, what basically happened is that the
And traveled the
circus,
world, I think.
the circus, the Glasscock circus, and most of the circuses in those days really were, with the exception of Barnum and Bailey, the really few big ones, they really didn't do anything in the winter because, you know,
Good point.
it was all over. You'd camp for the winter.
Mhm.
And they got hired. My dad got hired. He was hired by Barnum and Bailey in 1909. And they did that for some years. And where vaudeville comes into, see, what people don't realize today is that vaudeville was the single most popular form of entertainment in America then, because they had theaters in big towns. But all the little towns, I mean, you know, vaudeville was the vaudeville and the circus were the only two forms of entertainment. There were no, you know, no movies, no radios, no television. That was all there was. So what happened in later years is from 1903 to 1920, my dad and some of the other brothers they'd tour all over the United States with vaudeville too, when they weren't working for Barnum and Bailey or Ringling Brothers. And they did tours with Jess Willard, the boxer, and I've got colored photos of all that. My dad knew every one of these people from, you know, Fred Astaire, Eddie Cantor, Al Jolson. I mean, you name it, he knew them all. In fact, when they drilled their first wells down at Somerset in 1919, they promoted all these vaudeville people to come down and invest in the wells. And the funny thing is, the one that all the relatives remembered the most was Jimmy Durante because of his big nose. They remember him at Somerset walking around. And I got photos of him walking around at the rigs down at Somerset in 1919. But they didn't get in the oil business. The oil business just came along the way. As my father said one time, son, there's almost no business I haven't been in. He said, I missed insurance. That was a real scam. But yeah, I missed that. Now you call it a scam, called it a racket. That was the term they used. He said that was a real racket. Every child, every one of these sons and daughters was born in a different place, because they were all born up to 1898 was the last daughter was born.
Well, so your dad, W.D., from vaudeville sort of moved into the oil business because oil was starting to really happen.
Well, you know, the funny thing is, I looked up all these early Texas oil fields, and they had lived next to all of them. So it was like territory that they were already familiar with because they had been there.
They had come in.
And actually, John Benjamin They lived up at, John Benjamin lived up in Hamilton, up 281 north of Blanco here in 1905 was when they moved there from Longview. And they had actually had a place in Longview too, was another reason for the oil business thing, you know, all where the big hit was in the East Texas oil field. And they had a farm there from 1901 till they moved to Hamilton in 1905. In 1913 is when John Benjamin and Lizzie moved to Blanco and got the house up at, you know, I've heard various stories on who bought the house for them, but whether it was
This is the house in town or the house?
The house on Mesquite, and that was the house they moved to, and I've got photograph after photograph, you know, of people standing in front of that house all the way from then to in through the 30s, you know, until they died in the 30s, late 30s. But
so your dad would have lived in that house on Mesquite?
well, my dad's wife is Etta. She was in the circus with him and part of the act. She really didn't want kids. She just had these kids by accident, sort of. She had the son in 1905, and then she had Margaret, the daughter, who would be my half-sister, in 1907. And how this relates to the house up there and who lived where is that by about 1913, she was separated from my dad. She went back to Missouri most of the time, and they remained married for 3 or 4 more years, but my dad basically raised the children. But if he was gone all the time, it was hard to raise the children. So what happened is they wound up at Mesquite Street with John Benjamin and Lizzie. And that's why they're in some of those photos in front of the house there. And he would buy houses, like he bought a house in Cincinnati, Ohio for the winter season so he could have them come up there and spend the winter with him. But then most of that wasn't until 1917. So all those early years they lived at that house on Mesquite Street.
Once he got into the oil business, which was what, around
1918 or thereabouts when they started.
He left vaudeville and the circus and
He was actually still doing vaudeville as late as 1920. And Eastland, Texas, you know where Eastland is? See, that's up near there, near the Leon River again. Margaret, the daughter, was born in Gorman, Texas in 1907, which is up just northwest of Hamilton. And one of the first boom towns were Eastland and Ranger and in there, and they had lived or been through all of them because the circus went to every town, you know, Blanco and all the way up, you know. And well, what provoked them to get into oil business, I don't know, except here it comes and they'd try anything.
But they made and lost and made a few fortunes, I think.
Number of fortunes and lost, and it was pretty wild.
Is that what led to the ability to, the interest in building a string of theaters? I know that, I mean, one of the things that most ties your dad to Blanco and historically is the building the theater.
Well, he was tied initially when he had that brushy top ranch out there, and he had all that property, and then. And, you know, like I say, he used to give Lyndon rides to San Marcos on Sundays, and Lyndon came with date Margaret, the half-sister, and she couldn't stand him. And then he wound up dating Blanche, the cousin, which was one of Alex's daughters. She claimed she was engaged to him. I don't know. But I do know that she and Lyndon were fast friends because they still have letters between her and Lyndon, and she was in a child custody deal one time about the grandson, and she wasn't supposed to keep the grandson, but the grandson didn't want to go live with the new stepfather. You know how that goes. And so, but they had to be on the run because they had some kind of an order. And Lyndon would call her up and say, "But Blanche, you better get the hell out of there. The Texas Rangers are on their way." And everywhere they'd go, they'd be a step ahead of them coming to get the kid, you know. And I got all this from the kid himself. It was the grandson, and he has all the letters from Lyndon to her and back and forth. And another interesting Lyndon story was that they would go to these dances on Saturday night, but all the boys only had one pair of shoes, so they'd carry the shoes to the dance and put them on when they got there. And this one relative was buddies with Linda, and they'd walk all the time to the dance, you know. And nobody, my father, another reason I think he always wanted to be around my father was because my father was probably one of the few people that had a car. You know, because my father had made a lot of money already, and in the 1920s, hardly anybody had a car. My father had a Stutz Bearcat in the 1920s. And but anyway, so the children, this Leon and Margaret, were here with John, Benjamin, and Lizzie all those years in the teens, you know. And so that was part of the interest. And then my father bought property, and then my father bought every goat, sheep, and pig, and everything else that Alex had in the 20s.
Isn't the Girl Scout ranch out east of here, east of Blanco, was your dad's property?
He gave that to the Girl Scouts.
So even now, people drive by occasionally and say, you know where the old Girl Scout camp is? We're looking for it. You know, somebody who was there 50, 60 years ago.
Oh, where they were Girl Scouts or something?
Yeah.
No, we'd stay there all the time, and I'd sneak up there at night, you know, and everybody was...
It's a beautiful property.
I was a little kid, yeah. And you know, I never got the straight story from him. I should have asked him, but he was really actually pretty irritating because apparently he gave them that land on some conditions and they didn't live up to their part of the deal, and he wasn't happy about it. I gave him the finest place up there on the bluff overlooking the river. I built the dam, you know.
You built that dam?
He built that dam.
Oh, that's
he took me down when I was a little boy. He said, come on, son, we go down. It was kind of a drought. And he showed me where he had, when it was still wet, he had put W.D. Glasscock in 1938, just to prove he had built the dam, you know, showing me. After they made all this money in the 20s and lost it all and then made it back in the East Texas and what have you, in 1935, Lizzie Armstrong Glasscock, John Benjamin's wife, died here in Blanco. And so they felt like they needed to spend more time with John Benjamin because he was 85 at the time. He lived to be 88 when he finally died at the end of December of 1938. So my father decided to spend a lot more time up here, and it was during that period that he got the idea to build the theater, because he was going to be spending all this time up here with John Benjamin. So anyway, he got this idea to build this theater, and because he was spending so much time in Blanco. This is the last few years of John Benjamin's life, and so you know, he didn't mess around. He did it first class and built the theater, and it opened in fall of 1937. And these movies I referred to are, you know, during that period, because there's John Benjamin's birthday was in September, and so in the fall they would just each year they would have a birthday party for John Benjamin.
Didn't you describe a grand opening, or did I imagine that? Something that you described about the opening of the theater and spotlights and things, or am I thinking?
Well, I was wondering, some of these old timers would know. I wasn't alive when Blanco went open, but
okay,
we went to the other ones when I was a young boy.
That's right.
He would have these spotlights like in Hollywood, and it was just wild.
Right. You wouldn't have been born yet.
That was see, he built other towns, you know. He built the Stanley Theater in Luling. That's the one named after me, and he had then Leon got mad about that, so he named one the Leon after that in Pleasanton. And he built the one in George West, and that's the one where I told you the story where this relative, Leon's son, one of Leon's sons, who they're all the biggest BS story artists in the world, you know, started telling me, yeah, Roy, my granddaddy had Roy Rogers on stage with his horse Trigger there at the opening of the West Theater in West, and I didn't say a word, but I was there. It wasn't Roy Rogers. Well, it did have Red River Dave, but that's a long way from Roy Rogers, you know.
You described as a kid coming up almost every Saturday.
Right. Well, every weekend we would go to. Well, we started out, later on when he had the other theaters, we'd go to all of them. But in the early years, in the 40s, early 40s, every weekend was the drive to Blanco. And you know, it's 45.
What was a typical day? Describe that.
Well, first thing was trying to get here. It was like, I told my father one time, he started talking about he preferred the common folks, common man. And I said, Daddy, I remember all too well how much you liked them. It's a 45-minute drive to Blanco, and it took us 2.5 hours to get there because you had to stop and talk to every common man along the way. He'd stop at every filling station, get out and start talking. You know, we're all sitting there in the car waiting for him to get through, and we'd finally get to Blanco, and I mean, the first thing I'd do is head for the theater, because usually on Saturday they'd have a double feature. And in those days, you didn't have to exit after each showing, and you could stay all day if you wanted to, and they'd have a double feature, and in between the features they would have all these short subjects and serials, they called them in those days.
The theater, I assume, was crowded. I mean, when
Oh, it was
all
packed.
the old timers I talked to here remember that was the
It was packed. I mean, every Saturday it was packed. I mean, we'd come up, sometimes we'd go at, even in the night shows, there'd be people.
Kids and adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. No, I mean, what are you
Families.
gonna do in Blanco in 1941 and 2 and 3 and 4? And when I was a little kid, you know, I mean, it cost 9 cents to get in. And I thought, God, this is really good. It's 14 cents in San Antonio.
Their popcorn.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And the usherettes, which are on those films, you know, he had them in their little uniforms, and they'd come out, you know, and it was really cute. And it was
The cafe next door.
the cafe was next door. Yeah, see, that's in those movies too, because they would have the birthday party for John Benjamin in the cafe. And I've got, you know, you can see the birthday cake and everything in these movies, you know. And after we'd go to the movies, we'd go next door to the cafe and eat. And my father had this Depression era mentality, you know, like everybody was always hungry during the Depression, so if you could eat a lot, that meant you were prosperous, you know. And they had these big hamburger steaks there, and I ate 2 of them one night, and that was because the second one was at his urging, you know. Have another one, son, have another one, son. And you know, he said, God, you like that ketchup, so he bought me a case of ketchup for Christmas. But he would, you know, there was, most of the movies were Westerns, you know. I mean, it's Johnny Mac Brown and Hopalong Cassidy and
A little bit of Tarzan, maybe.
oh, Tarzan was on every time you turned around. I saw every Tarzan movie that ever been made, including the original ones. You know, the one with the big spider in it. You know, that's like the first or second Tarzan movie. And they had these Flash Gordon serials with Buster Crabbe and Flash Gordon, and Superman. They even had the Superman ones in, and it was. And the one for some reason or another, the one I personally loved, it's nobody's ever heard of but me, but they had every Saturday at the Blanco Theater, was this, the Durango Kid. And it was Charles Sterrett was the name of the actor, and he was the only hero that wore black. And I always thought either he ripped off Zorro or Zorro ripped off him. You know, I wasn't sure which. But and see, these would last like 30 minutes each. You know, and then here'd be another serial. You know, you'd go from Superman, you know, rescuing somebody who's on the, you know, on the saw, when they're going toward the saw. You know, and then Flash Gordon would be on, and then the Durango Kid would come on, and then you'd be back to the main event, which would be, you know, that could be Johnny Mac Brown or Hopalong Cassidy or Gene Autry or, you know, actually Hopalong Cassidy and Gene Autry were later, you know, because these early guys were like Johnny Mac Brown and what was that one guy, Thompson? I can't remember that guy.
Tom Mix?
Tom Mix, yeah.
It's obvious this film made a real impression on you. I'm amazed that your recollection of this thing.
Oh yeah, that was wild.
I don't want to forget the Ball Coon.
Yeah, Ball Coon. Well, see, I met Ball Coon in about 1942 when I was about 3 years old. We went out to Brushy Top, and that's where Ball Coon was living. Because when John Benjamin died at the end of 1938, all the brothers and sisters and everything showed up at the old house up there on Mesquite.
Well, how did John Benjamin come to adopt Ball Coon?
Well, who knows? He was from He was from Oklahoma. Like I told you, I had one relative, one of Alex's granddaughter said, "Well, I'll tell you this." She said, "I don't know about Ball Coon, but I can tell you this, that I never knew a Glasscock who adopted a child that wasn't his own." John Benjamin's real short and Ball Coon's real tall, so I don't know who he was, but he was a Cherokee Indian, right? And he was from Oklahoma, and Ball Coon adopted him as a little boy. Ball Coon was born in
family.
Oh yeah, no, he was side by side. I've got the article when John Benjamin died. How Ball Coon's the saddest one of the whole funeral, because he was like, as one of Alex's daughter told me a few years ago when she was 96, right before she died, she said, "Well, Grandpa wasn't much on working. I think Ball Coon did most of the work." And I said, "What did they do?" She said, "Oh, they planted fruit trees, and then they had all those Shetland ponies, and as a child, I had one of the last of the Shetland ponies out at the Girl Scout camp place." But he just helped, and I met an old fellow named Doug Wagner here in town. He was 80-something. I would say he's about 80. A couple of years ago, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember Ball Coon chauffeuring John Benjamin all around town." I said, "Well, I didn't take long, did it?" But he said, "Yeah, most of the little boys were kind of afraid of that big Indian, you know." And he said, "He seemed nice to me. I wasn't really afraid of him, but all the other little boys were afraid of him, you know." And I said, "Oh, he was real nice." But when John Benjamin died, they had a big meeting up at the house on Mesquite, and first thing came up was, what are we going to do with the house? And the youngest daughter's name was Bertie Benton. Her husband was named Jack Benton, and he owned the old feed mill here in Blanco. And she wanted the house. I took care of John Benton these last 3 years because she lived in Blanco all this time herself. And I think she was a school teacher or something. But so anyway, after much wrangling, they decided to give her the house so she'd shut up, leave them alone or something. Because apparently they were all a pretty strong-armed bunch of people, strong-willed people, and I mean, you know, they'd fight with each other tooth and nail over damn near anything, you know, and then be friends the next minute, you know. So they gave her the house, and then before they gave her the house, when Franklin Roosevelt outlawed gold coins, American citizens couldn't own gold anymore, John Benjamin made him furious and went out in the backyard and buried them all. So they're all out there digging holes trying to find the gold coins. And they found them and they divided them up between the relatives. But so anyway, I think Daddy then moved Ball Coon out to Brushy Top to live.
Okay.
I don't know whether he lived there the whole time or not, but if he didn't, he did from then on, because that's where I met Ball Coon. And the first thing I remember was how red his face was, you know, because he was Indian. And I said, "Daddy, who was that?" He said, "Oh, that's Ball Coon. He's the foreman out there now, and he's the last Indian left in Blanco County," you know.
Did he live the rest of his life out there?
No, he didn't, because what happened was in the 40s, later on in the 40s, one of the other brothers, Lonnie, was a younger brother, got Parkinson's disease, and he lived down at Mathis. And they moved Ball Coon down there to take care of him, to live with him. And he stayed down there till the early 60s when he died, and then he went and stayed at the other brother Gus's ranch, and that's where he died in 1965, about a year after the rest. My father and Gus died about 8 months apart. My father died first, but Gus was the one who became the most famous one because of the oil business. He was the pioneer of, he built the first deep water offshore drilling rig. I mean, he was in Time magazine and all this stuff, you know. But he became a tycoon. And my father used to say, "Yeah, I paid $3 a day, and I got the checks in the safe to prove it." You know? And he would take me over there for the christening of the Mr. Gus was the name of this rig that Gus built. And we went to Bethlehem Steel Yards in Beaumont. We went to the christening there. And Gus was running around with the governor and all that. My father couldn't care if there was a governor or who the hell he was. You know, that's the way he was about all these people. Nobody impressed him. It just didn't matter.
You told us a story about your dad that really stuck with me, about when he was visiting his friend somewhere in the bank down in South Texas, and he told us they were looking a little bit.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's one of the, there's
I mean,
some,
to
there's
me,
some,
that captured.
there's
he
some
was-
great stories.
He was in his.
He was in the 70s.
Yeah. And
That was in the 1960s.
Sure.
He died in 1964. But you want me to
share that story.
Share
'cause
that?
I think it
One day in the
captures the beginning.
60s, he died in 1964, so it was somewhere between 61 and 64. He said, son, drive down to George West with me now. I need to go to the title company. And so they had the West Theater down there, and we had a ranch down there at Clegg on the way to Orange Grove. And we head on down there to George West, and we pull up this title company, you know, noon or something, and we walk in. There's these two old guys there in their 60s, where my dad's in his 70s. And they all know him, you know, I mean, everybody knew him. You could, if my father had one thing, it was charisma. You know what I'm saying? Even my ex-wife, who didn't like anybody, said, "Oh, I loved your father." And I thought, God, at least she liked somebody. But that's just how
I
he
think
was.
some of that rubbed off on you, Stanley.
You know, but, no, he was. You haven't met charisma till you met him. You know, you have no idea. And in fact, so we get down there, and they say, "Hi, WD," because he was either called Donnelly or WD. And they go, "Hi, WD, how you doing?" or something. He said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "But you boys don't look too good." And, you know, they started laughing and saying, "Oh, sure, what are you talking about? You're 10 years older than we are." And he said, "No," he said, "you boys are in terrible shape. You know, you just don't look pale, you look wan, you look weak. I'm afraid y'all are going to die on me," you know, and all this stuff. He'd go on with all this, and they'd say, "Oh, come on." And so anyways, to get to the chase, he finally said, he said, "I'm in such good shape and y'all aren't, and I can prove it." And with that, he always wore a suit and a hat, you know. They didn't, all the way to the 50s, everybody still wore a hat with their suit, you know. And he just went, "I bet you boys I can walk across that room on my hands." And they said, "Oh, WD, you can't do something, do something, don't," you know, all this stuff. And he just kind of takes his hat off, puts it down on his chair, takes off his top, his coat, you know, his coat, and just pops up on his hands and walks across the room to the other side on his hands. And they were just like this, and I was like, "What?" You know? And he hops down just like there's nothing to it, and he was strong as a bull. I mean, when he was 78, he had muscles this big, you know, from all those years, all that circus work, and then working in the oil fields, because he's the kind that, he's paying the guy to do the rigging. He'd be out there pulling the cable himself, you know. I mean, in fact, he died about 10 years too young because he wouldn't listen to me. 110 degrees, middle of July, and he starts, we got a crew digging fence posts on the ranch down in Zavala County, and he starts digging fence holes. And I'm going, "Please don't do this, you're going to kill yourself." "Oh no, son, nothing to it," you know, and, you know, I mean, it's 110. Well, he was dead the next day, you know, because, I mean, it did him in, but he didn't think anything could phase him.
I think you got a lot of his athletic genes. I was told by someone who knows you in San Antonio that you were a rather great athlete, a golfer, I think. I forget what else.
Well, they remember I beat Tom Watson at golf.
Well, that's no small. That's no small accomplishment.
But unfortunately, my dad died before that happened. He would love that. He was the kind of, you wouldn't even tell him anything, and he's spying on what you're doing about the athletics and everything. You know, like I wouldn't say. He said, "Well, when are we leaving for the baseball game?" I said, "I didn't even know you knew we had one." You know, he would be at every baseball game. You know, I was on the first Little League team in San Antonio, the first year they ever had Little League, and by chance, I had a couple of friends who were better athletes than I was, but they didn't know what this Little League thing was, and they didn't join. They were mighty unhappy about it. So as a result of them not joining, I was the star. And
golf,
well, I was in all, but he'd go to everything. He gave all this money to help build the fields and all this stuff, and he loved it because. You know, while they put my picture in the paper throwing all these no-hitters and baseball and all this kind of stuff. But he was at every game, you know. And he'd bring his car seat out of his old Cadillacs. You know, he had a 49 Cadillac and he kept buying them because they had high centers and I wanted to hit the ruts on the ranch. We were in the 60s and he's got a 49 Cadillac, about his third one, you know, and he'd have a nice one at home in case mother had to do something fancy. But he didn't, you know, he wouldn't give you a nickel for all the fancy stuff in the world, but he was always, you know, and he wouldn't even know I was doing something. And out of the blue, he called me up and said, "Son, you should have started that skeet and trap shooting sooner, or you'd have been really good at it, but you'd started too old." And I didn't even know he knew I was doing that. You know? I believe this was taken shortly after Lizzie died in 1935 and was taken in Blanco. The guy on the left here in the dark suit is my dad. That's William and Donna Glasscock, W.D. Glasscock. The second fella, I believe, is his nephew, one of the sons of this fella in the middle here, who is Mike Glasscock, who's another brother, one of my dad's brothers, born in 1888. This is John Benjamin, who had been 85 years old this time. And this is, next to him is his daughter, Bertie Glasscock Benton. And this is Lonnie Glasscock, another one of the brothers, who was born in 1892. That's John Benjamin, my father's father, my grandfather.
And the picture was taken about when?
It was taken in 1886 in San Antonio, Texas. And he would be 36 years old. This is in 1903. My father was 17 years old, and she was a year or two older than he was, I believe. This was taken in Longview, Texas. On the back of the original, he scrawls, "My gal friend, Longview, Texas, November something, 1903. They got married in February of 1904. And they were an act together. Well, this is the house at the end of North Mesquite Street that John Benjamin and Lizzie moved into in the summer of 1913. And they lived there all the way until both of them the last one died in the end of 1938, and then after that, their daughter Bertie Glasscock Benton owned it into the 60s sometime.
And didn't you say she was a school teacher?
I think she was a school teacher. She lived in Blanco for many years.
And when was this picture taken?
Oh, this was taken in 2004. All the old brushy top buildings on these movies. That's a photo of Foster Fred Glasscock. He is the second oldest Glasscock brother. He was born in 1881. This photo was taken in 1912 in Boston, Massachusetts. You can see it's written up there. Yours, Fred, Boston, Mass, 1912.
And these are performers?
Yeah, Ruth was his first wife, and I just guess this other girl, Verna Smith, was just in the act. This was taken in 1907. This is Alex Glasscock, and these are his trained elephants. Actually, he had 4 of them, but there's only 3 in this photo. He wound up selling these 3 of the 4 elephants to Barnum and Bailey in about 1912.
And you're related to Alex?
Alex is my father's oldest brother. He's the one that was born in 1874. This is Lizzie. This is Alex's daughter. That's Alex's son, Foster, whose name was Flipper. That's the circus man. That was taken in Plutonia in 1911 when they were camped there for the winter. The circus was there for them.